It is so cold. I've been having oats in the morning just to keep warm. And as a texture person, I've noticed that surprisingly, I've grown to tolerate them much more than I used to. However, I would like to supercharge them with a bit more nutrients, so I've been substituting some of the oats for seeds, specifically chia, flax, and hemp seeds. First episode, I got a few comments wanting to know more about sourdough, so I'm gonna walk you through it from beginning to end. First, you're gonna need a sourdough starter, and if you wanna cultivate your own, all you need is flour and water. Generally, most people will start off with either bread flour or all-purpose flour, but technically you can use nutrient-rich types like whole wheat, spelt, or rye, which is what I'm using here. And this process is gonna take at least a week before you're ready to make bread, so you're also gonna need a little patience. I know that that can seem like a lot, especially if you've run into issues before. So also, if you do have family or friends who have an established starter, you can just ask them for like 1 or 2 teaspoons, or you can also buy them. So I started off with 10 grams of rye flour and 10 grams of water. Then on day 2, again, I fed it 10 grams of rye flour and 10 grams of water. But on day 3, I fed it 20 grams of flour and 20 grams of water. And I did the same on day 4. And keep in mind, that is less than the amount that is currently in the jar. And if you can tell, I'm now starting to see less activity. This is because it doesn't have enough foods. So now is when I'm gonna start to discard half of it. And at this point, you should throw that out because we're still trying to build a healthy colony of bacteria and we're not there yet. So I kept 25 grams of starter, and to that, I'm gonna feed it 25 grams of flour and 25 grams of water. This is what's called a 1-1-1 ratio. And that's just giving flour and water in the measurement that's equal to the amount of starter. On day 6, we see an immediate change in activity, and it's doubled in size. On day 7 and 8, my starter is consistently doubling in size, which is great because that's what we look for in determining when it's ready to bake with. But the stronger your starter is, the better your bread is going to be. So I'm going to keep feeding, and at this point, I'm also saving my discard. After feeding on day 9, my starter has not only more than doubled in size, but it's peaked within 4 to 6 hours. So that tells us that it is definitely ready and that it is strong enough to bake with. And now that your starter is thriving, here's a few things to look out for. Over a 24-hour period, mine has dropped significantly. You might have also noticed a little bit of this on day 7 and 8, but now it's deflated a lot. This is telling me that the starter is cycling through the food quickly. So now we have 2 options. Either feed it more by upping the ratio to 1-2, or I can just feed it a second time at night. So I'm giving it the same 1-1-1 ratio, which you can see it has already gone through the morning feed. So with this second feed, it's replenished and it can now wait another 12 hours until I feed it again in the morning. When starter is fed, it's happy, and actually it smells like whatever flour that you're giving it. So if it smells like vinegar or acetone, it means that the starter is very acidic because it's hungry. If it goes a really long time without feeding, it not only smells bad, but it'll develop a layer on the top, which can best be described as like a sheer black or a sheer brown liquid. And it is perfectly normal. Like, it's safe to consume, so you can either stir it into your starter or pour it out. But whichever you decide to do, you should definitely feed your starter after. And most importantly, if you ever observe pink or apparent black spots in your starter, that is mold. And you have to throw it away. There's no saving it. Now keep in mind, there are other approaches to making sourdough, so if you've ever seen anything different in which everything isn't added all at once, this is the easy version. So you want to stir your mixture until it's shaggy. What is shaggy? This is shaggy. It's basically just short for this doesn't look like it's done mixing, which it isn't, because right now the flour isn't fully hydrated. So we're gonna wait for at least 30 minutes and then come back to it. 30 minutes is the minimum. So if you don't remember until an hour later, that's fine. When you come back to the dough, it'll be a lot easier to work with, which is perfect because now we need to help the dough build strength. We need to stretch and create tension. To do that, we have 2 to 3 options: slap and folds, stretch and folds, and coil folds. Since the dough is still what I would call brand new, at this stage, stretch and folds are the easiest method. So as the name implies, you are picking up a corner of the dough, stretching it, and then folding it onto itself. You want to go as far as it will allow without tearing the dough. You repeat this process circling around the bowl basically until there's nothing left. But even after I've done the whole circumference, you'll notice that I'll sometimes pick up the entire thing and then fold it over again. This is just to ensure that it is stretched to its full capacity. Because again, we're creating tension. We want it to be a tight ball. Each time that we wait, the dough eventually relaxes again, so we repeat the process to build the gluten. Gluten is protein, so strong protein bonds create structure that traps in those air bubbles, allowing the dough to rise and give it that chewy texture that we love so much. And what creates the bubbles are the yeast and bacteria from the sourdough starter that are feeding on the starches and emitting gas. In total, we're going to do 3 sets. Afterwards, the dough will not only be more elastic, but also starting to form air bubbles, and that we don't want to disturb. So then we'll switch to coil folds. For coil folds, instead of picking up a corner of the dough, you pick up the whole thing from the center. And because it's now stretchier, there's a lot of length to the dough when you pull it. So when you set it down, it coils onto itself. Now we bulk ferment, which just means that we stop micromanaging the dough and leave it to continue eating through the giant feed that we gave it essentially. And we'll come back to it when it doubles in size or comes close to that. While we wait, I'm gonna need some lunch. So I'm dressing up leftovers of the butternut squash soup that I made in the last episode, taking the roasted vegetables that I used previously to make a sandwich on the focaccia that I baked, just throwing them into a salad. Also adding some smoky tempeh as like bacon bits. This is how I prevent myself from getting bored with eating the same thing over and over again. I only actually prep like 3 days worth of food. That's number one. And then over that course of time, I will add other ingredients that weren't there before to either garnish or switch up the flavors a little bit. And that's another tip too, like just prep individual components versus full meals. You can just put all of those things into your refrigerator separately and then decide later on which ones you want to bring together for that day. Generally, you'll note that your dough is ready when you see bubbles over the surface. It's not super sticky to the touch, and it pulls away from the sides of the bowl cleanly. But honestly, it takes time to learn your dough and what is typical versus atypical. On-the-job training is the most valuable because experience is the best teacher. I'm essentially just gathering the dough into a ball, again, creating tension, pushing the dough away with one hand, and then pulling it back towards me with the other, also appropriately called push and pulls. Once the outside is taut, we wait, and you can cover with a damp towel or a bowl to keep it from drying out. Then after 20 minutes, I'll come back and repeat the same thing for the final shaping. When we shape, we don't really want to disturb all of the air bubbles too much, so I give it just enough pressure to encourage the dough to stick to itself, stretching it very gently. When you're done, you can either put it into a banneton or a bowl that's lined with a tea towel or a liner that's dusted with flour. I like to use rice flour, and then we're going to set this into the fridge for a cold proof and then bake it the next morning. But you can leave it there for up to 48 hours. So if you like the more sour aspect of sourdough, longer will give you that result. When you do the poke test, well-proofed dough generally springs back slowly. And when you take it out of the banneton or the bowl, it holds its shape. But slight variations can occur, like this loaf that I didn't immediately put in the refrigerator after shaping. It not only grew significantly more, but it also isn't holding its shape very well. Like it's melting pretty much into a puddle. And while I would normally believe that this is overproofed, making this is coming up later in this video and it came out perfect. Using a lame or a very sharp knife, you want to create a slit preferably at a 90-degree angle, and this is so that when the bread eventually expands, it does so in a controlled manner based on the location that we've determined, rather than just bursting and cracking wherever it chooses. Not shown here, I also add a couple of ice cubes so that the steam helps the bread rise to its full potential. After 30 minutes, we then remove the lid and bake for an additional few minutes to develop the crust. And this you can adjust to your preference. So I go another 20 minutes and reduce the heat to 425, but I also continue to bake at 450 when I've forgotten to lower it, and it turned out fine too. While waiting for the bread to bake, I made oatmeal again, and after filling those pink bagels, I wanted to just test how much heat affects the pigment on dragon fruit, so I added it to this as well. The low to moderate heat that I used changed the hue from like a blue-based pink to a what I would call a muted rose tone, which was very interesting. In the last episode, I also made almond milk, and I got a few questions as to what I do with the pulp that's left over. I like to dehydrate it and just turn it into a flour. That way it's shelf stable and I don't have to use it right away. And of course, you can bake a whole host of things. What I would most often do was use it to make granola. Now, if you've been following me on Instagram, you know that I have been making so many bagels. Ever since my fail, basically I've just been making like multiple small batches. So this was my first attempt at trying different shaping techniques. I just roll it into a log, flattening one end with my hand. You can also do this with a rolling pin, and then you want to tuck that end into the flap that you created and then pinch it closed. This was quite uneven, but otherwise not that bad for my first attempt, so I just kept trying, and this is what I ended up with. Craving a little sweet treat, so I decided to make a pistachio loaf. This recipe is essentially pistachio cake from Instagram, and I've now made it at least 3 times. Or shall I say an adaptation of it, because I have tweaked the measurements slightly. I also bake it in a loaf instead of a cake pan. I skip the icing. Oh, and also I add a touch of matcha powder, because even though the pistachio is like the main flavor profile, the cake otherwise comes out pretty beige, so I just feel like it's only right to make it green, you know? But I will put a link to the original in the description box. If you do decide to make this and don't have a soy allergy, would highly recommend using soy milk because it really does mimic actual buttermilk, which is what the recipe calls for. To make it, you just add a tablespoon of some sort of acid. I used apple cider vinegar. Between this and the bread, I gotta stop participating in these big bag activities. Discipline, we don't know her. Whenever I go to Chipotle, I get a bowl, but if I'm treating myself, I'll get chips on the side so that I can scoop it up. And when I'm feeling particularly lazy, I'll just crunch them up and sprinkle them on top. So I'm taking the leftover tortillas from those breakfast burritos that I made, cutting off the rounded edges and turning that into nachos. I'm using the Caesar dressing that I made the other day along with chipotle peppers to make like a spicy dressing. If you're not crazy about like creamy dressings though, you can sub this for like a chipotle vinaigrette, just tossed with some red wine vinegar, avocado oil, agave or whatever sweetener you like, and then some oregano and of course salt and pepper. But because the Caesar is so basic, essentially being like a garlic forward rendition of the original, it's actually really easy to just switch up by adding additional flavors. If you want your end result to be less wet, you can de-seed your tomatoes before you add them to the salad. It just doesn't bother me enough because I don't want to create any more waste than is necessary. Since I was still determined to make my pink loaf for February, I decided to use this taro and purple sweet potato powder that I had. The reason I always use glass is because I like to look at the bottom to see what's happening. And recently I realized that doing this, I've been probably subconsciously relating it to something else. My starter, in other words, a tip for knowing when your dough is done bulk fermenting and ready to shape, is when it starts to look like your starter looks in the jar. You don't have to do folding this intricate for pre-shaping. This just happens to be the one that I like to do for my final shaping, so this way I get more practice at it. As I've mentioned before, I never discard any of my starter because I just bake with it every time I feed it. But one of those days I didn't make anything. So I used some of the inactive starter as a batter to make buffalo tofu.